First of all, let's just say in order of appearance, let me ask Don. Now, China is not the country of law, but China has a lot of laws because there's no procedural hearings, there's no particular consent of the public, so laws are very easily passed. So in this kind of a labyrinth of Chinese laws in the last several decades, how high a profile does the anti-secession law have in China's domestic legal system? In other words, has it ever been used in court proceedings, for example? Does it have any function other than to trigger military actions? Don?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it actually has a pretty low profile in the domestic legal system. You know, as I mentioned in my talk, it doesn't actually say you must do this or you must not do that. And so for Wang Yi to talk about you mustn't violate the law, there's really nothing there kind of to violate in its terms. I did do some research and found that there are some cases, and they're kind of interesting in one, it's actually only really been relied on as a substantive sort of source of duties in one case, and that was where there was a advertising design firm that somehow, I don't know how one can do this in China, but somehow they came up with a map of China in which mainland China was in red, but Hainan Island was not, Taiwan was not, and some of the disputed, the Senkaku Islands or the Diaoyu, they were not in red either, and so they were fined by the local administration of industry and commerce, and basically on the grounds that they had violated the anti-secession law with this bad coloring, and the firm argued back that this was counter to the rule of law because the anti-secession law doesn't actually say anything. But their appeal was dismissed. The other case, kind of interesting because of its complete ridiculousness, is where there was a South Korean cosmetics company that was suing a Chinese firm for blatant trademark infringement. I mean, they were just marking their own products with the South Korean cosmetics company's trademark. And the defense of the Chinese company, this was their first and most important defense, the one they were really gonna pound the table on, was that the South Korean company on its website had listed Taiwan and Hong Kong as countries alongside with the PRC, which of course has nothing to do with the issue at all. And I'm happy to say that the court declined this invitation to take up the cudgel on behalf of the hurt feelings of the Chinese people. They completely ignored that argument and they ruled in favor of the South Korean company. So there have been a few cases. Most of the times, in fact, in all but this one administrative fining case, the parties made an argument saying, one party made an argument saying we should win because the anti-secession law says, X, Y, Z, and the court ignored it.
Now my feelings are hurt by this Chinese, by Chinese interpretation of the law. Now, for those of you who have any experience living in China, one of the major political incidents during the Cultural Revolution was the Chinese issuing a stamp during the height of Cultural Revolution. The stamp is a mistake, is considered a major political crime because the stamp is called the 祖国山河一片红. All across motherland is covered with color red, except that they forget about the painted Taiwan red. So that is a major political earthquake, right, these days.
That stamp must be worth millions.
Yes, okay. If you're a stamp collector, that's more than a million, multiple millions right now. If you can find one, just to go back to your attic and to your grandma's chest to find out that one, and then you don't have to be here, and then you'll be somewhere traveling in the Caribbean. So a follow-up question, Don. It is what specifically does the Chinese law, this particular law, it's not in compliance with the international law. You mentioned that specifically, but is there any particular essential summary of that? What's the fundamental difference between this law and the international legal regime? I think Yu Jie also mentioned that a little bit.
So where is there a conflict between it,
That's right.
example?
That's right, yeah.
Well, one could, you could easily point to a conflict between the law and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, because China is a signatory to that. They haven't ratified it, but being a signatory means, you're not allowed to violate the fundamental principles. And clearly the ASL says that, even advocacy, even saying, merely speaking the words that Taiwan is independent or that Taiwan is not, since ancient times, a part of China, that would, in Wang Yi's view, constitute a violation of the Anti-Secession Law, whereas that speech is protected, under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Yeah. So there's a clear conflict right there.
Yeah, I think if you take Wang Yi's remarks any day, the conference can go on for 10, 15 hours, and then without any resolution, because he made a lot of statements that are self-contradictory. So let me, thank you very much for the comments, Don. Looking forward now, let me ask a question to Professor Chen. Let's discuss what is the future of Chinese anti-secession law. We have talked about some of the sort of brevity and the vagueness, opacity of the law. I mean, of course, discussions like this probably make me feel, geez, we did a terrible job, right? We got to counter the counter lawfare with our new efforts to launch an even larger lawfare. What do you think, China might do next in order to sort of be more substantive about this particular law?
Yeah, okay. So I think the general perception in Taiwan of this law is that there's a lot of thunder but no rain. 雷声大雨点小. So I think China knows this and knows that for it to advance the agenda to annex Taiwan, on the legal front, it probably has to do more. In recent years, I would say early to 2020s, there has been proposal that surfaced in public discussion in China about passing a new law. For example, passing a law on motherland unification. That was proposed, but that didn't really go anywhere. And I'm guessing that the officials or representatives of the NPC release this kind of information to sort of test the water and see the public reaction. But they probably are reluctant to do anything that's dramatic, such as passing a new law at this point because of the geopolitical concerns. So I think opposition from the United States and other democracies is very important if there's such a push in China to do more on the lawfare front, because I think it should be interpreted as a disruption of the status quo. I think China has some incentives to keep the law as it is now, because the law is not very law-like. It gives China a lot of flexibility to interpret Article 8. It gives some deterrence effect, but not hindering China's actions. So I'm hoping that China is not going to either pass a new law or pass implementing regulations under the law as the next step, especially when we're approaching the 20th anniversary of this law next year. I would say that even though China is not doing more on the ASL, but China has been doing a lot on other fronts. So I think it was last year, China passed sanctions, 2022, passed sanctions on a number of DPP officials. And the sanction list has all the important people within the DPP government, and some of them will continue to serve in Lai Ching-te's administration, including our incoming Vice President, Xiaobi King. And this is also another form of lawfare to use sanction to compel compliance from these individuals. This is very bad for cross-strait relations to begin with, especially at the beginning of the Lai administration. So I hope China will stop on that front as well.
Yeah, you basically answered the question I have next to you. What is the security implication of this law? Now let me just, I mentioned earlier I'm the fan of Elvis Tennessee. Elvis has a very famous song, said, only a fool would rush in. It seems to me that this law of 2005 is really China's forced action to rush in, because this law is an anti-secession law, which implies that will cover the entire motherland. But this law specifically is about Taiwan, right? It's nothing else, nobody else, nowhere else. So you notice Xi Jinping visited Serbia during his special European trip. The reason why Serbia is very important psychologically, politically to China is because Serbia's affinity with China is about one thing, that is Kosovo separated from Serbia. And of course, there were other former Yugoslav republics all separated. So from China's point of view, this created strong implications to regions like Tibet or Xinjiang, not just Taiwan. So that's why at some point, if they're not full, if I were them, I probably would not be rushing in to craft a law that has a broader implication, but don't focus on one contingency as Taiwan, right? So let's move on to next question I have. This is for Maggie. Okay, you mentioned about Resolution 2758. Now, 2758 is based upon the assumption that Taiwan is ruled by one party. That's KMT. I think the phrase I use, Chiang Kai-shek bandit regime. Is that in?
Well, they didn't say bandit, but yes, it's the seat held by Chiang Kai-shek.
But Chiang Kai-shek, okay. But Taiwan is not ruled by one party anymore. Therefore, the foundation, the conceptual foundation for that Resolution 2758, in my view, is gone. On the other hand, in addition, that in its competition for who should be the legitimate representative of China, Taiwan already considered, we're not going to compete for you to represent China. We're just Taiwan, right? So from the legal perspective, in addition to what you brilliantly analyzed, what do you think of that sort of the passage of time has basically invalidated the foundation of that kind of a resolution of 2758?
Yeah, so I'd say first that I was in Taiwan for the election this January. Last time I saw Vincent, he was wearing this really cool Team Taiwan jacket, which, they're great. Great branding. And I've been there also in 2020. I've been going to Taiwan for about 20 years, regularly, lived there 3 of the last 6 years. And it's a multicultural, pluralistic society. And so one of the things that I love going for elections is that you feel democracy in a really visceral way. And this time, our group of academics intentionally went to see vote counting at a temple, which is one of the, in addition to schools, which are used for polling places. And, I gotta say, we were all teary-eyed watching the grandfather who, if he had been in Taiwan, we assume, throughout his life, had spent decades under martial law, there with his grandchild who only knew democracy, watching vote counting occur. And it was and we had at that point, we're pretty clear that Lai Ching-te was gonna win, but it was not a given, and certainly a very strong showing by the third-party candidate, which is a whole other conversation. But I think that it just shows how much Taiwan has changed. And also that, in the post-World War II order, this idea of self-determination, post-colonialism, that we take much more seriously as a global society now, self-determination that's in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and just more generally that people have choices and that they should be able to make for themselves. So when you look back at history, one thing that Yujie and I were talking about in the car over this morning is the use of unification, or as it's written in English, reunification in the law, even though the Chinese is 统一, which is unify. It doesn't have clearly the RE part of it, like 再次统一 or something. But this idea that if you are going to talk about reunification of Taiwan and China, you have to go back even deeper into history to Qing Dynasty, and this time that even then Taiwan was not robustly managed by that. So I think this just idea not just of how history has changed since 2758, but even before that, post-World War II, going back to the Treaty of Shimonoseki, that it's really important that we draw not just the legal people into the conversation, but the historians to try to make sure Beijing is not also manipulating history history to fit its view. And here, I do think that this is the language of 2758, again, does not say Taiwan, and emphasizing that point and how it does not reflect where Taiwan today is an important point that needs to be amplified and is not necessarily heard enough on the global stage.
Yeah, history can function in either ways, right? We have to all 与时俱进, to follow the situation as it develops. Secondly, in the terms of international law, I mean, the International Court of Arbitration clearly rule that the historical affiliations alone does not constitute sovereignty claim, right? Does not really legitimize sovereignty. This is the famous 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. So moving on to that, anyway, anybody welcome to jump in, right? Yeah,
Could
please.
I jump in? It's very interesting that the resolution 2758 says intentionally that they're going to expel the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. They didn't use ROC, they didn't use Taiwan. And the reason was because Chiang Kai-shek at the time was competing with the PRC for the seat of China. So it was entirely the question about who should represent China at the United Nations. There's no discussion over the long voting process and even in the preceding years about the sovereignty of Taiwan, which country that should go to or Taiwan should exercise self-determination. That was not included in the voting result. And that is why the resolution used the word Chiang Kai-shek's representatives rather than Taiwan, because it was never a question about Taiwan.
Yeah, can I just add something?
Please.
So also at the time, Zhou Enlai apparently expressed his disappointment that it did not deal with the Taiwan issue. So he clearly understood that resolution did not say anything about Taiwan.
Yeah, well, if you read the Shanghai Communique,
They wanted it to, but
if you read the Shanghai Communique, the words are very, very interesting. Some of them even so embarrassing that the Chinese Foreign Ministry website doesn't even print the whole thing. If you go back to the Shanghai Communique, they use the word the liberation of Taiwan, for example, is our solemn duty, because Taiwan is a sacred piece of our motherland. Again, I don't know. I grew up in the province of Sichuan. I don't know how far back you can trace back, right, to say Sichuan is part of China. I mean, nobody knows exactly when the concept of China started, and they're all identified by dynasties, right? So that's basically is my next question. Maggie, you mentioned about somebody Yu Jie mentioned about Hong Kong. The development of Hong Kong has a very profound impact on the political discourse in Taiwan. It affected politics of 2019 tremendously. So Hong Kong was supposed to be the exemplary model of China's ultimate unification formula, or their pitch, that is one country, two systems. It was supposed to be, an experiment over there to show how wonderful this formula might be applied to Taiwan. So Mike, can you explain a little bit more about clarify the current legal situation in Hong Kong and how it differs from Taiwan in the context of PRC's lawfare tactics? How does this impact public opinion in Taiwan?
Should I take it? Or, yeah.
Whoever, yeah.
I can start, but I'd say first, I think that the really interesting longitudinal studies about sort of what people and the Taiwanese want for their future. It's a little busy to read on that, but I think the trend lines are so interesting, and they also ask questions on a regular basis about identity. Do you consider yourself Chinese? Do you consider yourself Taiwanese? Do you consider yourself both? And we've seen this, very dramatic increase. People who say, I am Taiwanese. That is how I self-identify. Still some that say I'm both, but I am only Chinese. I'm not Taiwanese, but I am in Taiwan. This is my home. Very, very low. And then those studies have been going on for a long time, and it's great polling because we have numbers for so long. But some more recent polling then tries to bring more texture into that. And so I think that I really commend the work of Lev Nachman, Shelley Rigger, and they've worked with some Hong Kong scholars to try to dig a little bit more. And what that polling finds is that there are, the majority of people in Taiwan have great affinity with Chinese culture, right? They either had family that came over after the World War II during the Civil War with the KMT or much earlier, but have ties to Fujian province or other parts of China. Of course, there's also the indigenous populations in Taiwan and people that have immigrated from other places that don't necessarily have that personal connection with Chinese culture. But what is overwhelming is the rejection of the political system of the PRC and that separation of saying you can go and celebrate Dragon Boat Festival and Chunjie and everything, but you can also say, I do not want how, this, because the democracy now in China, the whole process people's democracy. No, that's not real democracy to say you do need to have votes. So that I would say too is really interesting to look at identity and how people see China. But with Hong Kong, Hong Kong is a very different place because Hong Kong was returned to, in 1997, to China under the Basic Law. That Basic Law was supposed to give 50 years, and I will say at the time, I think most of us expected 50 years moving towards more democratic representation, not where we are today. But Hong Kong is a part of the PRC. So I always get worried sometimes when it gets conflated in conversations, Hong Kong and Taiwan, because they are very different as political entities and where their relationship is with Beijing. What I do think is so critical is this point about how what has happened in Taiwan over the last 5 or more years has influenced thinking on Taiwan. Certainly in the 2020 presidential election, and you saw the waving of the Hong Kong protest flags, a lot of affinity, and you saw less of that this time because it's not as immediate. But we just saw, of course, another wave of legislation in Hong Kong further restricting rights. And I'll just end by saying I recently had a conversation with a few think tankers from the mainland who deal with cross-strait affairs. And I made this point about what's happening in Hong Kong and the further ratcheting up with this, tightening the screws. People are seeing that in Taiwan. And their response is, well, yes, we've got this new Article 23 legislation, but we have to see how it's implemented. Don't get too, nervous yet. I said, but the way you see how it's implemented is people putting their personal liberty on the line and see whether they end up in prison or not. That's how you test that line. And that's not going to provide much comfort. Like, just give it a go and we'll see how it's implemented. And they had no response to that.
Yeah, okay. Yujie, actually, you mentioned a lot about Hong Kong, so please.
Right. So for Taiwanese to watch what happened in 2019 in Hong Kong was really horrifying. And there was understandably, a lot of sympathy from Taiwan for Hong Kong's cause. But I think from the Chinese perspective, it's a very different story. Now that they've already passed the national security law, they've managed to have the Hong Kong government and the LegCo pass the Article 23 legislation. I think China considered this as a victory in their governance of Hong Kong. And therefore, they take it as a lesson for Taiwan in the future. So I think in China's narrative, when talking about anti-secession law in recent years, there's a background of Hong Kong in mind. And they say that Hong Kong's handover wasn't done successfully, therefore leading to this quote-unquote unrests that in the following years striving for Hong Kong's democracy. And therefore, if and when Taiwan is returned to China, there should be more measures to control Taiwan in the first place. That's the lesson that the Chinese government gets when looking at Hong Kong and Taiwan. The other thing I would like to say about Hong Kong is the national security law has long-arm jurisdiction, and so it's created chilling effects not only in Hong Kong but also abroad, and that's intended by Beijing. In Taiwan, we occasionally will have this conversation. Should I go to Hong Kong? Can I post this on Facebook? If I go to Hong Kong, will this be a problem? We do have this kind of discussion sometimes not just with scholars, but with students looking at their future. So I worry about this spillover effect of the silence in Taiwan. And I think this is definitely desired by Beijing with long-arm jurisdiction. And we just have to be more resilient and know how to start that conversation without over-restraining ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could just add something. Yeah, technically China's criminal law, does not extend to Hong Kong. That's why they needed the national security law. But it does extend to Taiwan. So technically, Taiwan has no special status like Hong Kong does or like Macau does. And so the geographical territorial reach of China's, criminal law, which criminalizes, things like splittist activities, reaches to Taiwan. So, people in Taiwan are already, violating China's criminal law. So that's a very good reason not to go to the mainland. So you've got the national security law in Hong Kong that covers your seditious speech, but criminal law itself in China covers seditious activity by Taiwanese people in Taiwan.
So let me just, I think, at the core of China's one country, two systems formula is the idea that is you can continue your lifestyle, you can continue to do whatever you do, but except two things, right? Defense and diplomacy. Right? Defense basically means I can use the force of the state to suppress something over there from developing, right? And I'll tell you what I think that something is in a moment. And secondly, diplomacy basically to control and to prevent international recognition of that something that's developing. Now, I think that something that's developing is the sense of nationhood, sense of a different lifestyle due to long separation of development path. This country was born out of the benign neglect by the British Crown. And after decades of British fighting wars with other countries, the 13 colonies developed their unique understanding of their status within the British Empire. Their sense of independence, their sense of self-government, right? So it is that different lifestyle, that different awareness of sovereignty, popular sovereignty, that really separate the United States from the British Empire. That's basically what prompted the independence. And declaration of that is very important, right? So in other words, in the same sense, let me try to ask a question by way of a statement. That is, Hong Kong and Taiwan is unique in the sense that they're both self-governed separately, more or less, for a long, long period of time. And people living in those two entities have developed something that's called the nationhood, sense of their self-determination, sense of independence, right? So the question then is, would the international recognition is due? Secondly, do the people have the right to declare themselves as an independent and sovereign nation? Regardless of history, what the Chinese government might claim. So in my view, I think, what really triggered, well, in other words, is a different lifestyle based upon freedom, democracy itself would justify the declaration of sovereignty and international recognition of their independent country, declare or not. I think it really comes to independence when China says Taiwan independence. It's very ambiguous, three things, right? Is if there is a de facto independence, number one. Number two, is there international recognition of that? And number three, most importantly, would the Taiwanese leader declare such a reality, right? So your thoughts on that?
Who wants to start?
Well, I could say something. I think there's in terms of, international discourse, of course, there's a huge difference between Hong Kong, and Taiwan, which is that, Hong Kong was, in fact, part under the control of the Qing dynasty until it was removed from the control of the Qing dynasty by the British. And, colonialism is not very popular anymore. So, Hong Kong was on the list, the UN list of, colonies that are supposed to get independence, until China joined the UN and then said, take it off the list. China said take it off the list of colonies to get independence. We'll take care of it. And so Hong Kong kind of lost that status as a colony full of people waiting for independence from the colonizing power. All that happened internationally speaking is that they went from British control to Chinese control. And that's clearly, for whatever, of course, the reality is, of course, that people in Hong Kong had, developed their own culture, and they didn't want to be politically, controlled by China. But it's, of course, very different from what happened with Taiwan, which is that, of course, it was never under PRC control. And so, in terms of sort of international discourse power, Taiwan, has a much stronger case. I mean, nobody proposed sending arms to, rebel groups in Hong Kong, to support their independence. And in fact, I think most people in Hong Kong were just looking for genuine autonomy. I mean, they weren't looking for formal independence from China, I think.
Autonomy is...
But genuine autonomy.
Genuine autonomy.
Just the ability to do what they'd been doing, even after 1997 until, the late 20-teens, right?
That's true.
Just to do their own thing.
Yeah. Well, you're originally from Canada.
Yeah.
Welcome to the United States, by the way.
Yeah.
The same similar happened, right? Canada used to be part of the British Empire, so
Right.
it's the United States, and they're supposed to be independent, and they did. So what I'm saying, I'm trying to do a historical analogy. Hong Kong obviously is separated by the language, but also most importantly, separated by a different lifestyle. I mean, interestingly, my observation, correct me if I'm wrong, if you look at the international discourse on the issue of Taiwan, before maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was exclusively about sovereignty. Is Taiwan part of China or not? That's the international discourse, the UN or the international forums. Right now, it's different. It basically is really not about that at all. It's about something much more important. That is the Chinese model of governance versus freedom and democracy. So everybody in Europe, as far as I say, right, they approach this secession, sovereignty issue from a very different angle. So I think that's called the, 趋势, right? Trend, mega trend. Yeah.
But I think so first, that part of it is just being very practical, right? So I think if you asked, if I go to Taiwan and talk to my Taiwanese friends, and if I said, well, if you had a choice and you lived in a world where unicorns with rainbow manes frolicked, right? And there was not, would you prefer to have a passport that just said Taiwan and didn't say ROC? And they'd say, yes, but, and this is why the majority are saying status quo indefinitely or decide later, they also don't want to have, armed conflict with Beijing. And, the people, we hear about rightly that would cause, a massive disruption to the global economy, et cetera, but the people who would suffer the most are the people of Taiwan, right? So, part of this is sort of, it's the best they can get given the realities, and they know those realities, they live them every day. And so I think that's really critical. And this point, too, about the one country, two systems, which has been totally debunked, not just because of Hong Kong, but this idea that only it would change diplomatic and military affairs. Just look at how Beijing treats people within mainland China. So, for example, I think about LGBT communities and Taiwan, which had this amazing advocacy by civil society for same-sex marriage. The Constitutional Court, a real functioning Constitutional Court, intervened and said you have to allow same-sex marriage. The legislature had 2 years to figure it out. It did at the last moment, because of the Premier Su intervening. And then after that, you continue to have advocacy for same-sex family building and all these related issues. Largest gay pride parade in Asia. You think that would continue even though it has nothing to do with military or with diplomatic relations? Of course not. So I think that my sense is that people in Taiwan have internalized that there's just an absolute farce that anything of a real autonomy could continue if there was some sort of political unity with the mainland.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I'm not here to provoke any conflict.
Clarifying.
The question is that everything we discuss here, we prefaced the Taiwan, the Anti-Secession Law as a ruse for military action. Military action. So to counter the overall use of force, which is a foundational creed of U.S. policy toward China, toward Taiwan, we must counter all the auxiliary efforts by the PRC for that military action. So we're trying to make Chinese government realize the military option is not an inevitability. So, so this is basically what our effort here is to basically to dismantle the legal facade for that military action, not to provoke.
Could I add that I think the Anti-Secession Law is designed to prevent Taiwan from exercising self-determination. But I think from the Taiwanese perspective, Taiwan has already exercised self-determination during the democratization process. So I don't think China has a grasp of that, of the local views. And so as I just mentioned, that there's narrative that Taiwan is already independent. So Taiwan doesn't need to declare independence. It's the same strategy of, with the mindset of Taiwanese people. We don't have to do this over and over again. We've done it. We are here. In terms of recognition, I think it's really important, but recognition by other states, I think it's not as much as a matter of law as a matter of politics. Recognition is an act of political considerations. So you see a lot of strange cases in the UN where Taiwan, which meets all the statehood criteria, is not recognized, where Palestine, which may not satisfy all the statehood requirements, is already recognized as a would-be state. So this, I would say, for international legal scholars, is not an obstacle to Taiwan's independence, but it's an important element to Taiwan's defense, because without being able to speak at the UN or lobby the UN on its own to be able to, on an equal footing, engage with other nations, it makes Taiwan's position very vulnerable. So I just want to make it clear that legally speaking, Taiwan is a state, but Taiwan needs recognition not for the legal purpose, but for political purposes.
Well said. I think if you read political statements by all Taiwanese leaders, they've been very prudent and responsible. They never want to provoke China to take military action. President-elect Tsai Ing-wen, I believe his very first speech after he's declared winner, says, in my tenure, I'm not going to hold a referendum on Taiwanese independence issue. I'm not going to declare Taiwanese independence. Of course, it's followed by say Taiwan is already an independent country, exactly what you said. So that's an exercise of precaution and prudence and responsibility, right? So it's really incumbent upon China to act accordingly. Don't just try to create any rules to justify its military actions. Prime Minister, you are in a different realm than beyond this anti-secession law. Let me ask you a general question about what's your take on the current international big picture that is Vladimir Putin and China, it's Xi Jinping. They are forming some kind of cozy relationship, and he's going to China in a few days. And what's your take about the overall China, Russia, Iran, North Korea access from your perspective?
Yeah, well, thanks, Miles. I mean, I've been concerned about this for a considerable period of time. When I was Prime Minister, I referred to it as the arc of autocracy. And while many of these nations are not necessarily historically friendly to one another, there's no doubt that their interests have aligned quite significantly, and their objectives are even more aligned. And what is that objective? That objective is to undermine what is the rules-based order, to see a disruption of that and replaced by a grouping of hegemonic powers who can effectively run their own rules where they want to apply them, both within their own jurisdictions and across their regions. And so moving from a sort of a universal human rights rule of law-based approach to the international order to one based solely on state power and hegemonic power. Now that is very concerning. And so that is something Vladimir Putin's interested in. It's what the Ayatollah is interested in. It's certainly what Xi Jinping is interested in. And we're seeing this play out most particularly in the conflict, the hot conflict in Ukraine. I mean, Russia would not be able to have sustained their aggression in Ukraine without Chinese banks, without North Korean missiles, and without Iranian drones. And the supply and support that has come collectively from that arc of autocracy. It suits all of their interests for Russia to be doing what they're doing, even if they have no particular interest in Russia's regional objective. It certainly achieves their broader one. And that extends also to the undermining of the US as the dollar as the reserve currency, the consistency of payment systems around the world. Now, there's not having competitive payment systems which offer good value to customers and so on. That's free market economics. That's fine. But when I don't think their objective is greater market economy efficiencies, and I think we have to be very mindful of this. And I always have been, and it was a key driver for things like AUKUS, the Quad leaders, and what we're able to do back when you were working in the Trump administration with Secretary Pompeo, calling this out and trying to align like-mindeds to work effectively to provide a deterrent against this, because it risks pretty much everything.
Yeah, well, that was an excellent overview. You speaking of Australian relationship with the United States, Australia has been a staunch ally of the United States, not only on the overall geographic, geopolitical scene, but also on specific measures. The area that I'm aware of with the surging China threat to freedom and democracy in the world, to the United States, and I think Australia was among the first major ally that actually raised the awareness of the China threat, and you adopted the Anti-Secession Law much faster than us. And you did take a swift action in matters on Huawei and 5G, and on major issues of geopolitical importance. When I was in the administration, I think Australia is the best friend and allies. With a little persuasion, we have some work to do with other friends and allies. So from your point of view, how do you think, looking forward, you mentioned AUKUS, how should the US and Australia alliance take on this major issue? Because ultimately, there's increasingly new groupings of friends and allies, from bilateral to multilateral. Is there any chance for us to resume the ancient ANZUS treaty?
Well, I'm pleased to say the ANZUS treaty is alive and well, and highly functional and operational. And of course, we saw that brought into effect when the terrorist attacks occurred here against the United States on September 11. So ANZUS is alive and well, and AUKUS is now alive and well. You rightly point out the position that the Australian government took, both when I was Prime Minister and a minister in the governments of my predecessors. And we certainly copped some flack for that. There was a price to pay. And China imposed illegal trade sanctions upon us, and we had to resist that and weather that. And I was very conscious of that when I was Prime Minister. That was part of the price we were paying. But it was essential that we did, because if not us, then who? And we saw previously when China, the PRC, moved into the South China Sea and turned island atolls into airports, which later became stationary aircraft carriers. And unless countries like Australia, together with allies and partners like the United States and Japan, actually say no, then the PRC, or Russia for that matter, or Iran, they'll go as far as they can. And so unless you resist, they will keep going. And I found when I was there, particularly in the private sector sometimes, there was a lot of resistance to this, going, well, China's our biggest trade partner. True, China was. But at the same time, what price freedom? And I'm very happy to trade with whoever we can when it's appropriate to do so. I mean, we had very little trade with Russia, for example, but we had significant trade with China. But our view was always happy to trade with China, but we're not trading our values. We're not trading our sovereignty. We don't think other countries in the region should either. So, we stood up to that. We paid somewhat of a price, but That said, after the last election, China basically admitted that they'd overplayed their hand, and they pulled back, and I'm pleased they have a dialogue with the new government, but it doesn't seem to be changing a lot of their behaviour.
Yeah.
They're still sonar blasting our divers off the HMS Toowoomba and sending flares across our military helicopters in what are quite reckless and dangerous acts. So for all the talk, I keep saying their tactics may have changed at a rhetorical level, but their strategy remains exactly the same. So your question is, what do we do about that? Well, what we have been doing about it, and I think what we've seen is a layering of these alignments. And in some cases, they take quite a formal presentation, such as in AUKUS, but the Quad is designed as a more of an informal arrangement. It's not as we, I think, discussed many years ago, it's not an Indo-Pacific NATO and won't become one. It is a partnership which is informal to the extent that it enables us a lot of flexibility how we work with each other and draw others into the discussion, a sort of Quad plus in the region. And it works beyond just the defence space. It's in technology. It's in critical minerals, it's in supply chains, it's in humanitarian support, it's in health programs, it's in economic development. And I think this provides a really important message into the Indo-Pacific when we're layering all this up. Where I think it needs to be added to is outside the government sphere and seeing greater engagement of the private sector in these relationships with countries in the Indo-Pacific. We want Indonesia, we want Malaysia, we want Vietnam. We want the Philippines to have choices other than PRC, BRI deals, which come with ties and all sorts of obligations, which never ends well, as we've seen in the case with Sri Lanka. And so the best antidote to that isn't just governments turning up with their aid programs and the development support programs, but we need to encourage and mobilise private capital to be more engaged in those parts of the world. So it's diplomatic, it's economic, it's military as well, it's scientific, it's people to people, and we just have to keep pressing in every area of opportunity, and the more the merrier.
That's a fantastic statement. People always say Australia and the United States have a lot of mutual alliance communications, and I think the Australians' best exports maybe Nicole Kidman or
Keith Urban.
That's right.
The pair of them, they're terrific.
Or some other things, or Crocodile Dundee. But I think really the best export from Australia to this country is completely like-mindedness on major issues. We have friends and allies who are friends and allies on major issues, but they always try to position the global conflict as a matter of China versus the United States. So they can sit aside and to be a little bit more opportunistic, maybe sign a separate trade deal with China, maybe go the third way. So we don't see...
That's a good point, Miles.
Yeah,
because
thank you.
It's a point that I always thought the PRC never I think gave due respect to in their relationship with Australia. They would see their relationship with us through the prism of our relationship with the United States alone. And I'll give you a good example of where that can become confusing. We're often asked, and even today I was asked, in relation to Taiwan, what would Australia do? Now, I'll always be careful how I respond to that, but simply to say that if the view was that Australia would only respond in the context of our alliance relationship with the United States, well, ANZUS isn't triggered by something like that. It has to be an attack on US soil. But what is relevant, though, is that the taking of Taiwan by the PRC would disadvantage and really harm Australia's national interests and the region's interests as much as the United States. I mean, we would have our own reasons, completely independent of the United States and that alliance, for this to be of great concern. And so we have our own reasons for being in the Indo-Pacific. We have our own reasons for having our view. Yeah. And you're right to call it like-minded. It's not US determined. We have our own view. It just happens to agree.
Yeah. There's a shared values,
of course,
but also there's shared interest.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that clarification. Now, earlier, Prime Minister and I first made the greeting. He said, Miles, you've lost weight. I said, thank you for recognizing that. But I said, you're responsible for that too. I said, how's that? Yeah. Well, you're responsible for me gaining weight in the first place. Because you draw China's ire by suggesting politely for China to allow international investigation of COVID origin.
True.
So they basically sanction you. Yeah. The first item they sanction you is Australian wine. Yeah. So I'm not a drinker, but I start drinking Australian wine. So look at this.
Yeah. The freedom wine.
The freedom wine. So, and then China that contributed to my gaining weight a little bit. And then later on, China banned the import of pineapple from Taiwan. So I started eating pineapple, which is full of sugar. So my doctor finally said, Miles, you have too much alcohol, too much sugar in your blood, reduce the weight. So having said that, could you actually provide some insight from first eyewitness point of view? How did the episode develop?
How did
the episode that China reacted to your suggestion about COVID origin investigation?
Yeah, with great paranoia and a lack of accountability for what China had basically unleashed on the world. I still remain extremely angry at the lack of transparency and disclosure by the PRC around the origins of COVID. And before you even get into, did it come out of a lab, did it come out of a wildlife wet market, or did it come out of a cave or where there were bats, or who knows? But the point is this, it's called COVID-19 for a reason. It didn't happen in 2020. It started in 2019 and it was not shared with the scientific and medical health community in the world. And that failure led, I think, to the unnecessary deaths of millions of people and the destruction of economies and people's livelihoods and businesses all around the world. And there has never been the acknowledgement of that culpability. And that's not a political statement. This is incredibly important to ensure these things don't happen again. That there is an expectation that in an event of a pathogen outbreak such as that there would be an absolute duty of disclosure to ensure that this did not spread in the way it did. Now, I think there's been some good journalism that has led to, and Charlie Markson was a journalist in Australia who did a lot of this work, that really uncovered the likelihood of this having originated from a lab. At the time, our intelligence was not telling us that, but at least what we were seeing in Australia. But that said, my concern was, well, if it started in a wildlife wet market, there are quite a few of those in Southeast Asia, and we could be looking at something similar occurring as we'd seen with SARS and MERS some time before. So I just thought there was a complete disregard for global health and security. And our international system, I think, was very lacking in enforcing this. And so I just basically spoke my mind on this. And it was a view that others had expressed. And the PRC took great exception. But that's what happens when you stand up to bullies.
Excellent, excellent. Speaking of Charlie Markson, who's an Australian journalist, which actually brought up a very poignant issue. I still have this resentment in my inside me. That is the discussion about the COVID origin in this country, the United States, is so toxic, so politicized, that good journalism could not be done here sufficiently. So we would have to take an Australian journalist to do all the work.
Yeah, she did a great job.
I really encourage you to watch her, follow her investigation, which is remarkable. Yeah. So, and I think you're absolutely right about the culpability, and you mentioned about the argument. I think from the beginning the focus of the argument was sort of a little bit off center, because the issue is not only whether this thing is originated in the lab or in the market. Yeah. By the way, there's also a prevalent practice by the Chinese biolabs, including Wuhan Institute of Biology, to sell the lab animals and lab products to the civilian world, to the fresh market, right? Almost on the same day, the world began to know there is a widespread outbreak in China. There was a court in the Liaoning province in China that sentenced, I believe, 12 years to a biogeneticist of China for investment money, much portion of the money came from his sale of his own lab animals, mostly cow and cow milk. This is completely irresponsible. So the argument is that even if this thing came from the fresh market, seafood market, it could be from some animals contracted the disease from the Wuhan Institute.
In some ways, at least from a health perspective, it may have been, if it had come actually out of a lab, then it is a more contained risk.
Yeah.
And no one suggested, and I certainly didn't, that this was done malevolently or by design. But it was more the cover-up and the refusal to share. I mean, we were all, I remember at that time, desperate for information about what was going on so we could frame our own responses.
Yeah.
And, there was just silence.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
This was, and, the international institutions were left completely without any teeth to deal with this. And frankly, millions died needlessly.
I would say tens of millions would die. I mean, the idea, Secretary Pompeo asked me to scour the open sources about this origin, and it's just insane to see. The issue actually is not only about that; it's about the biosafety. Yeah. China's biosafety is abysmal. Not only I'm saying this, their own lab directors, including the director of Wuhan Institute of Virology, saying we have been ill prepared. We're not ready to handle this high level of toxicity. Yeah. So this is one issue. I mean, so we're focused on how to call this. Is it Wuhan virus or China virus? If you say Wuhan virus, you're racist. China virus, of course, you're racist. Yeah. And then you know what? So the WHO finally said on COVID-19. COVID-19 is not something that the Chinese government really likes because there's a word 19 in there.
And that's exactly right.
So you can even find a proper Chinese translation for that word. Yeah. Chinese government never used COVID-19 to indicate in 2019 there's something already there. Yeah. So that's why this whole semantic game, it got to stop. We had to go to the real bottom of this. Yeah. So that's a very important. Thank you for the leadership.
Yeah. Well, thank you. But the relevance of all of this after the fact is this was a very good example of what an alternative international order looks like if that's how they play by their rules in their own jurisdiction. Imagine if that was more of a global norm. And that's not a place where I think free-minded countries want to go to, and I think that's why it just underlines why we the scales now I think have been lifted from our eyes about what the true intentions are. Yeah. And look, there was a well-intentioned, I think, view in the post-Cold War period that as China developed its economy, and it's the greatest economic transformation we've seen in human history. And to be honest, they should be commended for that. The Deng reforms, economic reforms, which basically use market-based capitalism to achieve, this should be celebrated. But at the same time, I think we need to understand that they're not about to become a pluralistic society anytime soon. They're not about to, they accept the international rule of law when it suits them and then reject it, say, with UNCLOS in the South China Sea when it doesn't. They play by trade rules when it suits them, but then whack illegal trade sanctions on Australia when we say things they don't like, and then seek, in the future, Australia, I'm pleased that the wine trade will go back in, but that will be used and weaponised against Australia in the future if it suits their purposes. So I think it's good that we've woken up to the fact that we're dealing with a different world. This idea of a post-Cold War globalised economy, that ended. In 2012, I'd say, and certainly by 2014. And so the world is now more in streams, if you like, of like-mindedness. And, in some areas there's open trade around the world, but in others, I think we're seeing increasingly companies cease investment into FDI into China has just gone off a cliff. Private equity involvement in China has gone off a cliff. Large multinationals now are avoiding and scaling back their manufacturing operations in China to service their global markets. They retain them there for the purpose of supporting a domestic China market. So we are seeing quite big shifts. And I've been particularly impressed to see how countries like in Japan and South Korea, they were well ahead of the game on this. Mm-hmm. And we're already doing that. And I think now in the West, and particularly in the United States, Australia and others, we need to be appropriately applying the risk price to our investments and engage on operations in that sphere. I mean, we don't sort of rush into investments in Iran overnight or Russia. But for somehow, just because they've got a very big population, we think it justifies a no-risk investment in the PRC. Well, I don't think boards of companies can safely make that assumption anymore, or reasonably.
Yeah, I mean, China definitely can play a very important role in international commerce, international governance, simply because the country has enormous potential for market. For Chinese workers are legendarily hardworking and efficient. So those are very good things, very attractive things. But it's China's government policy, their guiding philosophy of governance that make this investment basically very toxic. People have to go. There is no such policy by any nation to decouple from China. But decoupling is happening because every company that invests heavily in China must look after the bottom line.
They do.
Yeah, if you cannot make a profit, if you cannot really maintain your corporate integrity, you got to get out of there. So that's China's own making. I think we talk about this conference is about law, anti-secession law. That law, from what I've heard from these early panels, is pretty much like outside of the realm of the international norm, if you will. I mean, Chinese. The economy is the same thing. There's an international norm and there's a Chinese norm. You cannot separate both. You cannot have it both ways. So that's why, what I think, fundamentally, the world's really big problem is that we embrace a essentially non-market economy, that is China, into the market-driven free trade international system. That's a major problem now. Unless we tackle that, and how much you impose tariffs on Chinese imports will matter, but matter much less because you have to look for the fundamental roots. The roots is that China is not a market economy. China is a communist country. And China does have the ambition to dominate the global.
So there will be a disruption in the global economy as the system rebalances because of that acknowledgement. Exactly what you've talked will mean a reorientation of many regulatory arrangements, of tariff arrangements, of how risk is priced and how investments are undertaken and what decisions CFIUS takes or FIRB takes in Australia. All of this will change, and businesses, this is a lot of the work I do now with American Global Strategies and others, is how you do that, how do you price it, how do you reorientate what you're doing to align yourself with the way the world is now working. And so that disruption needs to be understood if you're going to invest and plan for the future, because the world people are dealing with now is not the world they were dealing with 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, or I should say 10 years ago, let alone 5.
Prime Minister Morrison, let me ask you another question. Australia is strategically located over there. Australia has always been a stalwart for global strategy. World War II, later on in the Cold War. How do you envision Australia's role in the current regional tensions between China and pretty much everybody else in the region? South China Sea, East China Sea over there. Is there any such, in our military command structure, for example, Indo-PACOM, PAC fleet, we have Australian commanding staffs over there, which is very good, fully integrated. Would you, from Australian point of view, encourage the expansion of kind of international participation in some joint command to deal with the China contingency?
Well, I think you'd have to make the case first that the existing arrangements don't provide for an effective response. Okay. And I, there are people better placed than me to make that assessment. And I think you'd want to be listening to those who've been particularly involved in running those commands most recently. I mean, Admiral Aquilino has just finished up there. Harry Harris is, an enormous source of wisdom on these things, and I think they would have a better view about the efficacy of that. I think we have to be careful. Sometimes too many cooks with these things. You do need clear chains of command in these circumstances. I think you want ever-increasing engagement with other partners around this. About what the possible asks might be, or what the supplementary and supporting capabilities might be, given whatever scenario presents.
I think all that's very useful, and so you get a sort of a widening net of those who have a keen interest in this. But the degree to which you formally embed them in command structures, I think, is really an operational question for those who need to, oversee that, and they need to be able to act swiftly and with clear authority.
So you mentioned NATO, it's a magic word. You and I discussed this
Yes.
before, extensively. I personally have a wonderful experience cooperating with the Australian officers and admirals in my other hat. So Japan has reached out to NATO to try to establish some kind of NATO office or liaison office in Tokyo, to which some of the French allies rigorously objected. They always object to, most rigorously sometimes. So what's your view on that?
Well, let me answer it by talking about AUKUS, and it'll become clear in a second. AUKUS was made possible largely because of Brexit. If it hadn't been for Brexit, then I don't think the UK and Boris Johnson could have joined with me in going to President Biden and achieving that arrangement. And what I was interested in about that was drawing in the North Atlantic into the Indo-Pacific. And I'm pleased that we've seen more activity from the Germans and the French and others in the Indo-Pacific. This is very good. But I think getting some harmonisation between the Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific spheres on these issues is very important. And it goes back to the first response I gave you today around the arc of autocracy. What is occurring in Beijing should be of greatest interest to those in NATO as it is to Australia. And equally, what's occurring in Ukraine should be as great of interest to us in the Indo-Pacific, which is why Australia was one of the first to stump up and be there in supporting Ukraine. And Prime Minister Johnson, former Prime Minister Johnson, remains still the global campaigner for Ukraine, and he's right to do so because these are all connected. And so I think having a harmonisation of like-minded interests in Europe with those in the Indo-Pacific is incredibly important. Now, that doesn't mean from time to time there'll be a difference. I mean, the French and my government have quite a difference, but that was over a commercial deal, frankly. That wasn't over strategic issues, at least. That was about a submarine contract and who was going to build it, not the fact that we needed the right submarines. That's happened. That's commercial. But putting that to aside, there's no doubt that the French interests in the Indo-Pacific are very significant, and their knowledge is deep. And I think they're a very good partner in the Indo-Pacific. And we want to see more of it, is my answer. Okay, we want to see more and more of it. And I think so. A Japan input into the thinking of NATO is a good thing, just like Australia has had more participation in NATO, particularly in their forums. I think this is a good thing. We don't have to be a member of it, but I do think and I think Johnson's been really good at connecting that. I met with him on several occasions when I was Prime Minister, and often at his instigation.
Yeah. You were the only person who wear a uniform, I assume. Is it mandatory in Taiwan to have some uniform period? No.
Pardon?
Did you actually participate in Taiwanese military?
I've seen a couple of military parades in Taiwan. I mean, I was
that's enough. Yeah.
I was the host of the 2016 inauguration ceremony.
Okay,
and that was a big military ceremony.
All right. Parade. Yeah. So Heino, uniformed officer of the United States Army. So from a military point of view, what do you think that we should do collectively? Because after all, this anti-secession law is just a legal preparation and cover for military action. So ultimately, in the end, what kind of forces or international alliances that could really act together to mitigate the threat?
Well, overarchingly, we need to internationalize the Taiwan issue, because this is not just a China-Taiwan issue. It's not just a China-Taiwan-US issue. It will affect not just the region, but the world, if you ask me, if the Chinese are allowed to annex Taiwan. As Prime Minister Morrison said, there are countries that have their own national security interests in ensuring that Taiwan maintains its democratic autonomy. My fear today is that unfortunately, we've seen over the last several years deterrence failing all over the world. Whether it was the precipitous pullout of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, followed by in 2021 and 2022 the Russian invasion of Ukraine, now the war in the Middle East. The unfortunate truth that we grapple with is deterrence has failed, and I don't think we can afford for deterrence to fail in the Indo-Pacific, particularly across the Taiwan Strait. Now, I will tell you, I entered active duty in the United States Army on June 4th, 1989. If you think about what the PLA looked like on that day, notwithstanding, what they were doing on that day in the areas around Tiananmen Square, and you compare that to the PLA of today, it's night and day difference. Night and day difference. It is a formidable force, and they have advantages in certain key capabilities where, frankly, the United States, let alone our partners and allies, have to play some catch up. So I think we have to enhance deterrence. There's actions that the U.S. can take and is taking. There's certainly actions that Taiwan can and should take, and I would say the trend lines have been more positive in recent years, increasing defense spending, focusing Taiwanese defense investment on critical capabilities, reserve reform, and the like. But we also have to ensure that China understands that if it does something dangerous, if it does something precipitous, something adventurous, that there will be a cost imposition. And that cost imposition will not just come from the United States, but will come from partners and allies worldwide. And it will not only be a military cost imposition. I think what the Chinese probably fear more than anything is an economic cost imposition that will have an impact on the CCP's ability to maintain stability internally. And I think ultimately that is the greatest fear. The Communist Party fears no one more than its own people. And I think that is where we need to think about ensuring that deterrence pushes that button in the Chinese Communist Party's mindset.
Absolutely, I think I think that's an aspect. We often talk about the threat aspect of the Chinese Communist Party poses to everybody else, but we also have not adequately considered what's the weakness and the vulnerability of the regime. You mentioned about their fear of people. Absolutely. I also want to mention something else. That is, the international system is not really a system that focuses on one particular, unlike the Cold War, we have very clear-cut designated adversary, the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union-led bloc. In this case, you mentioned about 1989. 1989 obviously was a year of momentous importance, which started with the movement in Tiananmen Square that ended up in the fire of protest spread to Eastern Europe, ended with the coming down the Berlin Wall. The result of 1989 revolution in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union bloc, obviously, was the birth of a whole bunch of new nations, one of which is Ukraine, right? So today, Ukraine is much on everybody's minds. Now, also one thing that's really we have failed to address that the role Ukrainians play in modernizing the Chinese military since 1990s when it's become independent. Every single major weapon platform in the PLA warehouse right now has Ukraine's fingerprint there. That's because Ukrainians was left with the enormous amount of Russian design and Russian-made, Russian-engineered weapons, right? So Ukrainian has been relatively very irresponsible for decades, right? Supplying China from aircraft carrier to heavy bomber engines to missile technology to amphibious landing craft. Ukrainian made the best in not the Eastern Bloc. So it is therefore I think we failed to stop that. If you look at it, I mean, I grew up in Sichuan province. In Chengdu, there's aircraft plants, and not far from where I grew up. A lot of Ukrainian engineers, even today, they have a Ukrainian village. So China massively transplant that kind of Russian technology to there. So the point I'm trying to make is you cannot really sort of stop that by U.S., Australia, a few allies. Everybody is at stake. Now, we also notice that Ukraine is not a victim of the exactly same kind of logic of aggression. that Xi Jinping is having right now against Taiwan. That is, Vladimir Putin's justification for invading Ukraine is basically based upon ethnic, linguistic connection, heritage, not on international law, which brings to the question I asked earlier. Did the independence of Ukraine in the aftermath of Soviet Union breed a particular type of sense of nationhood and sovereignty, right? If that's the case, and if we were fighting Ukraine to defend, fighting Russia to defend Ukraine's independence and sovereignty, should the same rule apply to Taiwan? So that's basically the question I'm asking over there. But nevertheless, that's more of a statement rather than a question. Thank you very much. I'll move on to the next question. That is, this is for Bonnie. So how do you assess the effectiveness of international legal mechanisms and norms in addressing China's actions, particularly in the context of the Anti-Secession Law? Are there any specific areas where these mechanisms fall short? As China continues to disregard international law, what innovative legal approaches may be taken to counter the PRC's actions in the Indo-Pacific? I think, since I grew up in China, I'm going to quote Karl Marx. Karl Marx famously said that the philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The question is how to change it.
I think that's an excellent question, and maybe perhaps that would have been a question better for our legal expert, because I'm not an actual expert on international law or legal issues. But one thing that I did mention is that in my opening comments is that we haven't really seen much statements aside from this conference and some few events here and there, any real public events raising the awareness of how problematic the anti-secession law is. The last time when we really saw governments take a position on the anti-secession law was 2005. And as I mentioned, that was a different context, a different leader who was using the anti-secession law in a different way. Now that what we keep on seeing is every time China mentions the anti-secession law, we sometimes report on it, sometimes it just happens, and then we refute what China wants to do with the anti-secession law, but we don't refute the law itself. So I think one way to counter the anti-secession law or to respond to it is in our response measures, both the United States and with our close allies and partners, don't respond to just the action that China's taking, but also respond to the rationale and justification for the Chinese action. So I think that would go a bit further in what we're doing right now. But if I could jump quickly on the question that Heino was answering earlier with respect to what else we could do on the military front or on the security front, I would highlight, and both Vince and Heino also had the opportunity to participate in some of the work that we've done at CSI, is I'm personally really worried that we are very well prepared for the high-end contingencies. But we're not as well prepared to deal with the lower end gray zone challenges on the military side that China could pose to Taiwan. And one of the things that we're working on at CSIS is looking at ways in which China could use quasi-military law enforcement actors to engage in larger scale operations around Taiwan that would be similar to military operations but aren't exactly military operations. And it's in this gray space that actually also touches on what are the legal ramifications of these types of actions that we, when I say we, the United States and our allied partners, are least prepared to respond to.
Yeah, that's a very good question. For many of us, almost all of us have the experience working for the government. When I, with my limited experience in working in the government, and I feel there's an urgent imperative. That's a double urgent, right? That is, we do not have the weapon of the law to deal with some of the regional concerns. One example is South China Sea. China has all kinds of laws, kind of a justification to claim most of the entire China Sea. The U.S. government obviously disagree, but we have never legally challenged the Chinese claim. Only there's a former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia about 20, 50 years ago in a congressional hearing casually mentioned that we disagree, but there is no particular systematic elaboration. Until July 2020, Secretary Pompeo wrote out a document that said, no, we regard China's claim of South China Sea, two words, completely unlawful. So that's the first time we actually mentioned those in those legal terms, but we need to follow up with that. The law is very important. American is a rule of law. Without Taiwan Relations Act, which is a domestic law, that sort of guarantees Taiwan's legal status within the domestic jurisdiction. Taiwan probably legal status will be far less than that. My view, look at this, is in terms of Taiwanese domestic politics, and American domestic politics, the TRA actually gave Taiwan the equivalent of the green card holder. In other words, you can, China got this citizenship passport in the international recognition game. That is, because of Taiwan relation law, the Taiwanese interest in the United States enjoy pretty much everything except one thing, voting, right? So tax, legal protection, many of things, not analogy may not be absolutely accurate, but the point I'm trying to make is American domestic law, Americans' legislative response to some of the laws that might impact the national interest of the United States can be very, very useful. That's one reason we invite some lawmakers this morning to make them some remarks, right? So my next question is to Vincent. Vincent, you're a elected member of Taipei City Council. This guy's amazing. I went to his seat over the Taipei City Council, just like an American city council. A lot of mess, a lot of arguments, a lot of procedural inquiries. So it drives you nuts, but he's
Particularly the mess.
He's a man of supreme aplomb.
No.
From your perspective as a Taipei City Council member, what role do subnational governments play, like Taipei City, in responding to China's coercive actions? And in what ways can cities like Taipei contribute to regional peace and stability?
That's amazing, Miles. Thank you, because I think that's the first time I've actually been asked a question on my formal role that actually pays me, which is being a member of the city council. I'll just start by saying this, actually. It's very interesting. You brought up the Town Relations Act, and it's every year we have this argument, which is what should we do with the anniversary of the Town Relations Act? Because there are people that say we should celebrate it or commemorate it, but then there'll be others that remind us that that was the same year that we had broken off diplomatic relations, and celebrating may not be the right form of emotions to take. So I think what we normally end up with marking the 40th or 45th or 43rd anniversary. So that's always been interesting to me, sort of Taiwan's own relationship, and it's a weird relationship with the Town Relations Act and all of that. But you had asked me this question about subnational governments, and I'll say this, it actually does play a very, very big role, particularly now because the PRC has suspended exchanges at a national level with Taiwan. And so right now we have, for example, a yearly forum between Taipei and Shanghai called the Twin Cities Forum. And this is a difficult forum for, I think, many people, because while ostensibly it's about municipal exchanges, the reality is that in China, nothing is separate from politics. Everything is connected to politics. And so even on issues, for example, on a municipal exchange, you would always see messages that are hidden in there that have to do with politics. So for example, the head of the TAO coming up and saying that this is based on the 92 consensus, or based on one China, or based on both sides being one family. The precondition that was exerted in 2014 or 2015 upon newly elected mayor at the time, Ko-Wen-ze, for him having to say to a number of Chinese media outlets that both sides are part of the same family, for the PRC to then grant the holding of the Twin Cities Forum. So the PRC works in various channels to affect what I think the topic we're discussing here, which is unification or anti-secession or annexation. And this idea that this takes place in isolation in the political, economic or military sphere is wrong, because it takes place in a social sphere. It takes place through disinformation. It takes place through subnational governments. It takes place through civil society, through the press, through all of these different channels. And so when we talk about social resiliency, it's really all matters of society. But that's where we have a lot of difficulties, because we're a democracy. And different parts of society have different views on the PRC, and different views of how to engage the PRC. So for example, the DPP, we hold, 5 seats of 22 in Taiwan's subnational governments. There have been cases where KMT subnational governments have banded together and said that we accept one China. So therefore, can you open tourism just to our cities and counties and just forget about everybody else? It happened in the past. So it's a mixed bag, and it's very difficult. But I hope what we can do, and I think what the DPP is trying to do, which is to forge a greater social consensus on how we can manage cross-strait relations, and it has to be done together. Like if everybody has different perspectives and views and channels and ways of engaging, then ultimately you don't have cross-strait policy. And so cross-strait policy has to be based on this government, DPP government, finding ways to encompass most of society under a single umbrella. And that's what I think one of Taiwan's legacies will be, which is bringing the DPP to the center, bringing the Republic of China, Taiwan into the mainstream, and using that to forge a greater social consensus to deal with China as one. But it's going to take time.
Okay, so the subnational level of government engagement with the Taiwanese counterparts have been weaponized and become toxic in mainland China. What about the Chinese diaspora in places like, for example, your city council, your city interacted with a representative of the Chinese diaspora in places like Tokyo, London, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, maybe it'd be less toxic. There are some voices that obviously cannot represent the official voices of mainland China, but at least there is some more liberty and freedom to speak their mind, not necessarily, representing the local government of China, maybe some trade associations, some, association of scholars, and those people have sort of maintained some connection with the mainland China. Would that be possible?
Yeah, well, it's a tough question. I mean, many people live in Taiwan where at one time or another, or family members were Chinese diaspora. I mean, at one point, my grandparents were from, Shanghai. So, technically, a few generations ago, we were Chinese diaspora. But of course, we have a Taiwanese national identity now because ultimately...
Did your grandfather started in Taiwan?
Oh, I wish he did because I don't think I would be here. Or if I were here, my job would be to open a branch of Din Tai Fung here in DC, which would be great. But I guess my point is this, is that Taiwan is a multicultural democracy. And I struggle to put labels to say that this person is a Chinese diaspora, this person isn't. As long as you, support and abide by all the privileges, rights, and obligations of being a citizen of the Republic of China, then, in my view, there's no differentiation. But that's my view. And what's unfortunate, Miles, is that the PRC doesn't view it that way. They view all so-called diaspora or all people who have roots with the PRC as potential tools that can be weaponized. And that exists whether in Taiwan, whether in Australia, whether in Canada, whether here in the United States. And what we see in Taiwan is that there is a tendency for people that have recently come from China to organize politically and to become a political force. And there are people that are political forces in support of the DPP, KMT, but there are also political forces that are in support of the CCP's political objectives in Taiwan. And we have to be clear in terms of understanding where their motivations come from and whether those motivations are pure or those motivations are directed by the PRC. So it's a really tough question. And I don't think I have an answer to that other than to say that the trends of politicization of a so-called diaspora community, I think, is an ongoing thing in Taiwan.
Okay. All in all, I think what we're facing here is the extraordinary inflexibility of the PRC government change. Some of the fundamentals, and then the question then is, what about our dream of changing China since the time of Richard Nixon? So the more fundamental question is right now is not whether, how, and whether we should change China or not. The question that is really, really important to ask is, if that's not happening, is China going to change us or not? Is China changing us at all right now? So with that question in mind, and I think any discussion about regime change or not is totally useless, because if the regime doesn't change, by whatever force, the regime is changing us in more ways than you realize. So I think we probably we're almost out of time. I think do the panelists have any extra final thoughts?
Oh, the audience,
Audience, we have time for a couple questions. Yes.
Sure. Thanks. Bonnie, you talked about the sanctioning of people who advocate Taiwanese independence. I do, but there's also to advocate a greater role for the Republic of China's distinct, Huadu, and I'm wondering if you're seeing similar directed action towards that or that advocacy, or is it strictly in the Taiwanese independence advocacy camp, the deep green camp?
I think what we're seeing, and this aligns with China's typical carrot and stick approach, right? We're seeing, I feel, more specific targeting of different elements within Taiwan society. And I'm sure both Vincent and Heino can speak on this too. Part of it is a recognition at looking at the election results that I mean, Beijing will never say this, but I think there is some recognition that now you have the DPP for the third term, which from Beijing's perspective is even worse in the second term and the first term, that China has to shift some of its strategy. So what we've been seeing is an intensification of various ways to divide Taiwan. And that division occurs in both imposing punishment where possible on selective actors, but also offering carrots. So I think we'll probably see a little bit of everything moving forward. And I worry that the anti-secession law will be leveraged increasingly in the cases of punishment as part of the long list of justification of why they can punish different actors.
Okay, next question.
Thanks. Russell with the Global Taiwan Institute. I just want to build off of Piero's excellent question, I think, but broadening this out a little bit, what other applications of the anti-secession law can you foresee the PRC utilizing? You mentioned that it provides a legal justification for invasion of Taiwan. It's applying it to sanctions of individuals. What other elements do the expert panelists see as potential applications of the ASL for other types of range of activities?
I'll tackle that. I think it will continue to be used to create seams between the United States and its partners and allies, just to stay along the same lines as the One China principle. And I think what the Chinese will do, and candidly, they've taken a page out of our own playbook, because if you recall, we've certainly, as I mentioned before, during the Gulf War, used international law to justify that. We also we have, for instance, now an annual report to Congress on the PLA, which again is mandated by domestic law. So the Chinese have kind of taken this example that we've set and are using it against us. And they realize that on the one hand, particularly under Xi's leadership, there has been a pushback internationally against Chinese aggression, authoritarianism, and venturism across the globe. Again, Prime Minister Morrison talked about the sanctions levied against it, well, against Australia, when Australia just called for an international investigation to the origins of COVID. If we look at, for instance, Lithuania enhancing its relationship with Taiwan, how the Chinese reacted over and over again. So I think we're going to see using the anti-secession law and other laws to create those seams between those countries that, for instance, find it in their national interests to ensure Taiwan remains autonomous, and those countries that either, for whatever reason, either aligned with Beijing or fear Beijing's economic retaliation, will not be as forward-leaning. And that's why, again, I say that we need to move on to internationalize this issue and to debunk the anti-secession law. And as has been mentioned again previously, I guess I'm not saying anything that's original here, the Chinese pick and choose when they want to cite laws, okay? And they pick and choose when they want to ignore international law or when they want to ignore international agreements that they signed up for. So we need to hold them to account, and we need to publicize this more and more. And I think we'll actually find a more, internationally, a receptive audience for this, because I don't foresee, particularly as long as Xi remains the leader, that they're going to change their tactics. They may water it down a little bit, so the wolf warriorism has died down. But even if you look at, in recent months, it's now being reported, for instance, that after President Biden met with General Secretary Xi in Woodside, since then, the number of Chinese dangerous intercepts of American aircraft and ships has declined. Simultaneously, though, the Chinese number of dangerous intercepts of third country vessels, most recently, for instance, last week, an Australian helicopter, has increased. So these are all these types of things that we need to put a spotlight on, because I think it will resonate.
Well, let me quickly add. I think somebody should sue the PRC government. I'm actually serious. Like, somebody that's not too afraid of going to Xinjiang should just raise a court case. Why? Because within the Anti-Secession Law, there's actually articles that state that the PRC will engage in all sorts of exchanges with Taiwan, and they've not engaged in any of those exchanges. So, somebody could say technically the PRC government's in violation of that. But, I joke, but the truth is that they've always picked and choose, what they want to apply and when they want to apply it. And my fear is this. So Russell, your question specifically was on, do you see any applications beyond kind of the rationalization of force? And my fear is this. My fear is that within, I think it's Article 2 or 3, it actually compels Taiwanese citizens to support unification. Like, it's pretty clear on that, which is that I think it's quote unquote, Taiwanese compatriots also have this responsibility. And so what we're seeing right now is they're really going after people at a granular level. I was joking about the the list of 5 new sanctioned individuals in Taiwan. Miles is on the sanction list. Secretary Pompeo is on the sanction list. Miles had his name actually carved off his middle school in China for, in their view, betraying the motherland.
It's true. Thank the Chinese authorities, because ever since I graduated from high school, I never knew they covered my name over there. They ever know somebody actually go there to pay tribute to my past glory. So now I realize that. Thank you for mentioning.
Well, this is what happens when you're too humble. So they carved his name on because he was number 1 in his class, and they took it off because now they see him as betraying the motherland. But my point being is that they're going after people at a very granular level. And so I think what we see as a potential use and a fear of the Anti-Secession Law is then they cite this as another basis to go after people they view as not being sufficiently patriotic to the PRC enough to compel unification on their terms. So that's one specific use I think we should watch out for.
And if I could add to that, I guess and this goes back to the comments that Professor Clark made. I feel like China will use the anti-secession law wherever it wants to justify what it wants to do. And I think the language in there is broad enough that China could use the anti-secession law to almost justify any non-peaceful use of means against Taiwan. I've seen some Chinese scholars write recently that maybe the anti-secession law could be used to respond to high-level U.S. visits to Taiwan and against U.S. arms sales to Taiwan too at some point. So it's not just targeting Taiwan. It could even be expanded to target the United States and our activities too.
Okay.
Thank you. This gentleman first.
Hi. Can you hear me out? Yeah. I have a question. I wanted to ask it earlier, but I think it's still appropriate here. I think the secession law is a special case of something far deeper, a presumption in China of jurisdiction over all things Chinese. Anything related to China, any thoughts related to China, actions related to China are jurisdictional. And it's as if China's laying an intellectual property claim on the concept of China. And it applies, and it's actually a kind of legalization or internationalization of Stalinism. And Stalin's talking about engineers of the soul. It's as though China, the party, is laying claim to a part of everybody's brain, any part of that involves China, that's their intellectual property. And the problem is, so what they're doing is they're laying claim to the definition of China. It's illegal, but it goes further. How about proper understanding of China? Oh, you didn't properly, which it's wrong, it's illegal, then basis. So I think that's on. There's just this underlying presumption that that is, is spreading, and it comes with those, branding issues about Marriott making a mistake. But there is that, presumption of intellectual property over the concept of China applying across humanity. I don't know what.
Is that a comment or a
about
question?
that? Yeah, it's a kind of.
Okay.
It's a kind of question. Actually, I wanted to ask the legal people, where does that come from? Is this idea uniquely Chinese communist? Did the Nazis have this type of idea about Germany or things? So I was curious about, so my question would have been, where does this come from? Is this uniquely, say, Stalinist?
Well, I'm sure the Chinese invented it. I mean, just ask them. I'm sure, had it come out of China. But I'm not a legal scholar, but I know that, for instance, during the Nazi era, there was this concept of Volksdeutsche that the Nazis used.
I think that the communist ideology represented a total interpretation of the universe as cosmic laws. So to do that, you would have to invent new concepts, dictatorship of the proletariat, for example. Nobody ever heard of that. People's democratic dictatorship. I mean, you cannot be democratic and dictatorship at the same time. But in their logic of ideological interpretation, everything makes perfect sense, right? So secondly, in addition to creating new terms, they also have a reinterpretation of the existing terms as commonly understood. For example, the issue of human rights, totally different from Chinese perspective. You can talk about all the beautiful things about human rights, and then that means different. In the 1980s, 1990s, it was a rights to exist, right? 生存权, rights to livelihood. In other words, people as a fundamental rights is about economic rights. It's about making money, become rich, and then only when you become rich, you can talk about human rights. You can talk about freedom and democracy, rule of law. But now Chinese government doesn't talk about it anymore. You know why? Because Chinese government say we have lifted $800 million out of people out of poverty. We are really, really wealthy now, and you cannot really make that theory believable anymore. You cannot say we have become rich, we have developed economically enormously. In the meantime, you still have to avoid talking about human rights and freedom, that kind of stuff. Another one is the whole process democracy. What the heck is a whole process democracy, right? Their whole process democracy means that Xi Jinping get a unanimous vote to become all kinds of chairman. He's chairman of everything. So one of their legal justification to deny the legitimacy of the 2024 election was that in a three-way election in Taiwan, that President-elect Lai did not get it 50% over, did not get a simple majority. Therefore, his election was illegitimate. This is from the spokesperson of the Chinese official office in charge of Taiwan affairs. It's laughable. If that's the case, though, then the question then is, Chen Shui-bian got a majority in 2004. Tsai Ing-wen got an overwhelming majority, even though 57%, in 2016 and 2020. Would then that election be justified, legally recognized by China? So this is a kind of self-defeating concept. Play mind game, conceptual ambiguity is expertise of Chinese Communist Party.
Chinese give themselves a free pass. It's called the law of contradiction. Something and its opposite can be true at the same time. It's fundamental dialectics.
We can all blame German Hegel for that.
I think this gentleman, Miles, I think.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And my question is for you, Vincent. As you mentioned that the current administration's main task on the ASL is to form a social consensus and basically unify the public and both the KMT and the DPP to form a uniform perception and then a strategy towards China and the ASL. My question would be, what would be the exact steps and these detailed strategies and efforts the DPP of this administration will make towards that goal? Because just as you mentioned, some of the KMT's party leaders have publicly agreed with the one China policies, which is far different than the political opinion from the current administrations. So how would this administration's fill the great gap between the two parties and form a bipartisan decisions, policies on this aspect? Thank you very much.
Well, I'll put it this way. I used actually past tense, not future tense, because I think this is one of President Taiwan's historical legacies, which is being able to bring people together with a more common understanding of what national identity is. I mean, we have to look at past history. I mean, the DPP since democratization, has been, I think, suspicious of this idea of the Republic of China and had associated the ROC with martial law, had associated with the KMT, having as one-party state, authoritarianism. And conversely, I think the KMT through much of the past has always been suspicious of this idea of Taiwan. I mean, this idea that Taiwan is inherently different from the ROC. And so what I think the DPP has done in past years, starting in 1999, when we had our Taiwan Chenhu Juewen resolution on Taiwan's future, but extending and accelerating, particularly past 2016, was bring the two ideas closer together. And so Tsai Ing-wen has said, the Republic of China, Taiwan. Lai Ching-te said during the campaign that, Tsai Ing-wen has used this unified society. I will continue to use this phrase. And so I think this is something that's we're already in the process of, and we've seen success in. And I'll put it this way. We do have a divided government right now. I mean, there's going to be a lot of areas where we're just not going to get along because of fundamental differences in how we see things. But I do see optimism on the horizon, and optimism meaning that we're seeing, I think, greater convergence on this idea of national defense. We're seeing convergence on the idea that we need to understand the CCP and the PRC's, I think, core objectives are something that the Taiwanese people don't accept. I think we're seeing greater consensus on the status quo, meaning that maintenance of Taiwan's democracy and freedom in light of the challenges we face. So we're seeing convergence on several issues, even if we're seeing divergence on other social political issues. So I'm optimistic that our country will be able to come together to deal with cross-strait issues in a more united manner. And I served as campaign spokesperson during the campaign, and I did see that I think the KMT, there are elements of the KMT that are changing their views on the CCP. Ho Yoi had said, for example, that he wouldn't, he said that we can't rely on the CCP's goodwill or something like that, whereas Ma Ying-jeou then erased that by saying, no, we trust GDP explicitly. But my point being is that, and that's a back and forth, right? But I do think that Tsai Ing-wen has started that process of bringing society together. And I think and I'm hopeful that will be continued under Lai administration as well.